Steamboat, where have you gone? Where is your lonesome song? Like a mighty organ plays an old refrain, your whistle blew away my cares and lonely pain. Steamboat, blow your whistle again.
Welcome everyone, my name is Holly Parker. I'm the director of the Schiller Coastal Studies Center. On behalf of Bowdoin College, I'm happy to welcome you here tonight to this beautiful building. As many of you know, this facility was greatly enlarged over the course of the pandemic. So the building you're sitting in now, as well as our dry laboratory down below and our cabins, are all new to the Schiller Coastal Studies Center. Many of you have enjoyed its trails for a very long time. I'd like to acknowledge that this place was a gift of the Fallheimer family initially, and then the renovations you see today are a result of a gift from the Schiller family. I do want to offer Bowdoin College's land acknowledgement, at this time. Bowdoin College is located on the ancestral homelands of the Wabanaki. Today the Wabanaki include the Abenaki, Maliseet, Nipan, Passamaquoddy, and Penobscot nations, who have deep and enduring relationships with Maine's lands and waters. We acknowledge the painful legacy of the region's colonial history and commit to better understanding it while also celebrating the vibrancy of Native American cultures and working to build a more inclusive community. I offer this statement because it is also core to what we are trying to do here at the Schiller Coastal Studies Center. We are celebrating 25 years as a marine and oceanographic field station serving Bowdoin College, its faculty, its students, and visiting researchers like John Allen back there. This has really been a vibrant place for 25 years. What the Schiller gift is allowing us to do is to broaden our mission and also invite the community into our work that we're doing here. So I'd like to offer you just this update on our mission statement because I think it's really relevant to the work we're doing tonight. The Center's goals are grounded in our core identity as a marine research facility in the belief that through interdisciplinary and disciplinary inquiry, our community of researchers and educators can help ask and answer the questions that will help us support thriving coastal communities, economies, and environments. As we continue to evolve as a center, mirroring the change we are seeing in the Gulf of Maine every day, we aspire to ensure 5 key goals, and I offer 2 of them tonight as I think they really resonate with what we're doing. First, we welcome new voices and engage current voices to join us in our research and education programs. So it's so great to have John here tonight to offer us some history of this place that we love so much. And that we want to, through all of our programming, create a deep sense of belonging that inspires stewardship for the health of our place and planet. And so I think it's really important to acknowledge the role that history and understanding our history brings to that. So I'm going to be here all night. I would be happy to chat with you about the work we're doing here, but I will hand over the stage to the folks from the Hartsville Heritage Land Trust.
Hi, I'm Tom Westfall from the Hartsville Heritage Land Trust Programs Committee. We're grateful to have access to this wonderful facility. It seems a little incongruous to have a history lecture in a science hall for the land trust, but it somehow works, and we're really appreciative of what the college is doing to reach out to the community here in Hartsville. Tonight's speaker is no stranger to many in the audience. I think probably everyone in the audience knows John. For those who don't, however, he grew up in Bath, but to his credit, he's a longtime summer resident of Wars Island. Graduate of Brown University, he holds an MA in architecture from the University of Oregon. He's a recognized authority on historic preservation and design. And believe me, he knows his stuff. I volunteer at the Penobscot History Center, and one of the most useful reference works that I found there is something that John produced in 1993. It's an amazing survey of Brunswick newspapers from the 1840s to the 1920s, and lists every architectural event mentioned from house fires to groundbreaking for office blocks. In effect, he digitized the newspaper before it could be digitized. It's a truly remarkable piece of work. I thank you every day.
Oh, very good. Thank you.
John has spoken previously to the Harpswell Historical Society, to HHLT, to the Majewska History Center, and Mystic Seaport on a range of local history and maritime topics. John says he's retired, but you wouldn't know it. After a long career in historic preservation, he launched a new endeavor producing and presenting original educational slideshows on significant but often overlooked main historical subjects. Last summer, he debuted a program on the Baxter Canning Company, which you can view at, I think, the Downtown Brunswick Association has a recording of it. And it's really worth seeing. And tonight we're privileged to hear his latest effort, the history of the steamboat era on Casco Bay. And without further ado, John Goff.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Don. Thank you, Holly. So, and you guys can hear okay? That's question number one, and you're comfortable? Very good. Don't get too comfortable, because most of the chairs have wheels, and if you're just kind of going backwards, we won't, we'll see you on an ebbing tide, as they say. But, all right, this should be fun. You guys are the guinea pigs. This show has never been shown before. So the title of this talk is When Steam Whistles Sounded Here, Revisiting Some Steamboat Days of Old Harpswell, and we're doing it for the Harpswell Heritage Land Trust at this location on August 10th. And the Harpswell Heritage Land Trust has this beautiful logo, no doubt you've seen before. This is a work in progress. I've got to stamp that because this is clearly evolving all the time. The HHLT says as its kind of slogan or its key areas of interest are nature, community, forever, which is a wonderful series of concepts and subjects and very, very important for the place, natural and social. I wanted to also add, though, there's, as Holly pointed out, there's an acute interest in preserving history as well, and so I just had to put a little plug in for that statement. And originally, I was thinking this would be a 240-slide presentation, which if we do it at 15 seconds per slide, will take us exactly 60 minutes. However, I kept finding more interesting things, and I couldn't say no. So, so it's got more than that. But I am a firm believer in being able to push this advance button quickly. So that was the original time estimate, 1 hour. We are now going a little over that. We have 90 minutes for the slot here. And oh yes, we need to orient you. So okay, my responsible to orient you, you are here. This is where you are. In the galaxy, you're located right there. And if that's a little hard to understand, this is probably something you've seen more often. This is a map of Harpswell. And the subject of this really is steamboat era in Harpswell. So we have a Harpswell-centric focus on this. And as far as where you really are, for those of you that don't know where you are, we are on the north end of Orr's Island, which is right there. And as you look at this map, you can see you're pretty much in the dead center of all of Harpswell. Harpswell is an amazingly diverse area of peninsulas and islands, all strung out. And this is a graphic that shows Casco Bay. And you can see how Casco Bay and Harpswell are often thought of as sort of interchangeable, because Harpswell takes up, looking at it, almost half of it. It extends to the middle of Casco Bay. It's unbelievably large. And I've got Portland over there on the far left, shaded in green. So you've got an urban center on the left, on the west, and you've got Harpswell and all of its magnificence over here on the east. And the steamboat era really begins when people in Portland want to give more offerings to their people that are coming into Portland, and they bring steamboats all the way out to Harpswell for the scenery and for other, mostly for the scenery, but also for the access to these beautiful islands. And so this is a picture of a axe chopping a stump into two. And I have that because just as the metal goes through that wood, cleaves it like butter, you'll note that Harpswell itself is actually cleaved in several directions. It's cleaved in two major directions, east and west. And to this day, we do have West Harpswell over that way and East Harpswell over this way. And we got these cleaves in three directions, north-south, and that produces Great Island, Orr's Island, and Bailey Island as the three major islands on the east. And so you can think of it as divided two parts one way and three in the other, and that kind of gets you to understand what Harpswell is all about. And I saw this graphic earlier this year. I don't know if you guys have seen it. This is presenting all of Harpswell as an ink splot, as an accident that happened. I just love this graphic. It was published by Down East in January issue, and it was done, here's the illustrator, Mike O'Leary, and it was done to kind of celebrate the fact that the Harpswell Anchor has been revitalized as a community paper, and the Down East thought that was so important they really want to do a whole article about that. So that's where that graphic first comes into being. But I like it because there's a Rorschach ink blot test. And you can see a lot of Harpswell, and it's just figure-ground relationship is a Rorschach test in itself. It's quite complicated. Now, the paper, the Harpswell Anchor, has done a wonderful job of pulling all these disparate pieces together. All the Cundy's Harbor, East Harpswell, West Harpswell, the islands, all come together through a newspaper, and you get a sense of community through that. What I'd like to propose tonight is the steamboats did something similar. In all the routes they took, and all the people they brought over, and all the regularity they maintained in their stops, they created a community as well, a steamboat-based community. And that community created life on these islands in the Victorian era and early 20th century. And for those of you that haven't been to this part, eastern part of Harpswell often, if you go south on Route 24 and just keep on going until your car's almost no longer on the road, you can get to Land's End and this big gift shop down at the end called Land's End Gifts. And in that big gambrel roof building right there, you can actually find this book, which is the Bible of the history of not just Harpswell steamboat days, but Casco Bay steamboat days. And this is a beautiful book. It came out back in the 1990s. I highly recommend it. Captain William Frappier was the steamboat enthusiast who compiled the data and published the book. He's no longer with us, unfortunately, but his son does run a steamboat tour service in Portland to this day. I invited him to come too, so we'll see if that happens. But there's just a very rich history. Here's Captain Frappier who wrote that book. And the reason he wrote that book and got interested in that whole topic is because he was a grandson of some of the Johnsons on Bailey Island. So, and he would come visit his grandparents up the hill from Steamboat Wharf on Mackerel Cove and start hearing about the steamboats and seeing them come in, and he just fell in love with the subject that way. So Bailey Island has a lot that it's contributed to steamboat history. It produced, in a way, Bill Frappier and his book. Orr's Island has also produced a lot. Orr's was the terminus point for a lot of these lines that came out of Portland, so all the boats would typically come this far before going back. And because that was the terminal island, captains and steamboat people would often own property here on these islands, as you guys know, for example. The Daniels had some property, and then, of course, Captain Morrill also had his house. You can still see that down on Route 24, Stephen Black's place. So Orr's Island was very prominent in its own right as kind of a counterpoint to Portland, because they were the terminal points of these steamboat runs. Now, this is a picture taken in the 50s, about 53, I think, in Portland, and it shows the Alco-Cisco and the McCoy, and then the steamboat Pajepscot over there, all tied up. Casco Bay Lines ran the steamboat service in the 50s, and that was about the time it was ending. And I don't know all the reasons it ended, but we do know that between 1881 and about 1953 or so, that was the golden era of these old wooden steamboats on the bay and in Harpswell. If you go down to Land's End, you'll also see nearby this statue, as you all know probably, of Elroy Johnson and the main lobsterman. And so lobstering is an important industry around here as well. Here's a lobster boat I happened to take a picture of coming into Mackerel Cove the other day. And there's a lobster. Now, when you go down to Land's End gift shop, you'll see that some local people have taken this shape and interpreted it to be that shape. And they've put a whole bunch of them on a pallet to produce this American flag, which I just love. Now, probably the artist was trying to say something to the effect of fishing is an American birthright, or something like that, which is why they've got the lobsters as stars and everything else going on. But recognizing that that can also be seen as a Y shape, the lobster, you can say this symbol is actually saying, why would you want to ever study steamboats in Harpswell? I'm sure that comes to you. And the answer is right there, too. It's American. Steamboats were an American invention. And not only were they an American invention themselves, but they helped, American as apple pie, you might say. They contributed greatly to the expansion of the U.S. and the exploration of the Mississippi River and the whole development of the modern U.S. So it's a nationally significant subject. You'll also find when you get into steamboat history, I found, there's this fascinating dovetailing with Native American history. Now, Holly mentioned the Wabanaki people, and of course, they're still here across the state and across the Northeast. One reason we get the Native American crossover is because the steamboats were first intended to be used by summer rusticators. Rusticators were city people with urban knowledge and experience, and they were coming to the country to get fresh air, which was not so fresh in the city, and beautiful scenery with pine trees, which you didn't see many of those in the city. And there was a sense, too, of you're traveling on an exotic waterway, you know, with Wabanaki and Native American names like Chebeague Island, like Sebascodegan Island. You might be traveling on the Auco Cisco, which sounds very exotic and foreign. These are all Wabanaki names. So you're already getting indoctrinated to the sensitivity of there being a whole other reality out there just by the names that are around you and the literature the steamboat company's giving you. And what happened as the era evolved, you could actually find physical presence of Native American wares and people and goods on these islands once you got here. There would frequently be a little souvenir store near the landing on Orr's Island where the princes would sell Indian baskets like this. These are Wabanaki baskets made of ash and sweetgrass woven together, beautifully colored and being sold by natives. They might be Penobscot baskets coming from down north, like this one. This one was woven by Barbara Francis, the Penobscot I met in New Hampshire. Or they might also be Passamaquoddy, but they were, a lot of the Wabanaki peoples brought their summer sales goods to these islands and sold to steamboat visitors. So anyway, just through those subjects, you're going to learn something about the Eastern Woodlands Indians who occupied this portion of the country. And this is a map showing the Wabanaki territories. And basically there's 5 major tribes, I think Holly suggested it. The Mi'kmaq or Micmac, Nova Scotia primarily, the Maliseet, the Passamaquoddy, the Penobscot. And then you've also got a whole bunch of other tribes, smaller in number perhaps, that are collectively called the Abnaki. So you've really got the 2 M's, the 2 P's, and the Abnaki are the Wabanaki peoples. Those 5 is another way to explain that. And if you really look at, well, what does Wabanaki mean and why do we call them that? Why do they call themselves that? It translates to people of the dawn land. Wab means bright, like a bright sun, and as in the east. And anyway, it's people from the dawn land. So the concept of people of the dawn land is very important in Native belief, and that's why a lot of them were here. And their heritage goes back quite a ways. We know that the last ice age here in Harpswell was about, I think about 11,000 years ago. But some of the pieces that you can find around here are about 3,000 years old. It's pretty standard. Late archaic pieces can be found. And so let me just show you a picture. Here, so the 3,000-year-old period is also called the Red Paint people in Maine, or it's also called the Maritime peoples. And relics from their being settled here can be found along the coast. Over the last 40 years or so, my stepfather, Bill Carhart, and I have found nearly half a dozen of these pieces, and just along the shore. And here they are. And some of you have seen these before. I've shown them at talks. The one on the right, on the bottom, I'm sorry, was found, Bill found that down at Land's End, right near the gift shop, down on the beach. So that was a native site, and that's where that was used. These other ones I found on Haskell's Island, the Goslins Island, Flag Island, and Bailey Island. And these are all pecked and polished pieces about 3,000 years old. and the scholars believe they were all blades for an adze, A-D-Z-E, which is a tool like this, which has not changed in form since the Egyptians. And they've kind of moved from stone blades to metal blades, but this is the tool of choice for carving out wood when you're trying to scoop wood out of a tree trunk, for example, if you're trying to make a wooden canoe, a dugout canoe. So the Wampanoags, the Mashpee Wampanoags down at Plymouth Plantation, still make these to this day. And there's Philip Wynn, a Mashpee Wampanoag, demonstrating how you can stand on the end of a machoon and use it for fish spearing. Here's Phil on the right and Darius Coombs on the left, both of them showing how you can also use fire to start the process of hollowing out a log and reducing it to char, and then you can come back in with your tools and you carefully control this burning process, and that's how you make a boat. And so those are some of your earliest boats, especially down south in Massachusetts. Here in Maine, where the birch trees were more common and all, and in later years you get the birch bark canoe. Just was an amazing piece of engineering. Very speedy, very light, can be carried anywhere. It supports nomadic people and fishing and all kinds of things. We do find, though, up here in Maine, there was the use of the wooden dugout canoe earlier, before the birch bark canoe was popularized, and in recent years they found dugout remains in the mudflats off of some of these cities here in southern Maine. So it's mind-boggling. There's still stuff out there, you know. So what's interesting too about the birch bark canoe, I kind of think that when they started designing the steamboats beginning in the 1880s, and they're looking for speed, and they may have borrowed some of the ideas of the hull shape from these canoes, because this was a state-of-the-art, speedy hull shape that worked really well. So we're going to talk a little bit now. Alco Cisco, was the name of a steamboat. Yes, that's up until preparing this talk. That's all I knew Alco Cisco was. I've since learned it was much, much more than that. Alco Cisco was the old name for really all of Casco Bay and all of the islands in Casco Bay. And there's a reason why I think it evolved to the name that it is. But the natives would migrate in those canoes. They would do collecting fishing and shellfish along the shore here, and they also wanted quahogs. And they would migrate seasonally. They'd occupy upriver places and inland in the wintertime, and they'd come down to the coast in the spring so they could have summer camps down here, and they could get the coastal food so they could smoke and dry fish and shellfish and then pack it all up and bring it back to survive another winter in a winter camp. So the canoes provided the mobility to do all that. You may have noticed this sign driving down Route 24 where the old Truthant Farm was. They now have a new Corten steel sign that says Quahog Farm. I'm not that crazy about the aesthetics of that sign, but the name is important because it reminds you of the quahog. And the quahog most of us take for granted. I know I certainly do. But if you're native, you don't take these for granted because the white and the purple and the shell are prized commodities, and the substance is so hard. If you know what you're doing, you can make jewelry out of it. You can make wampum out of it. Wampum is a series of small drilled beads that can be strung, and they can be used for jewelry, like a bracelet there. They are also strung together to make treaty documents, the treaty wampum. And so after a tribe has negotiated peace with some other group, be it Dutch or English, whatever, typically a treaty belt would be woven, and that's considered sacred, and that's your library. That preserves what was agreed, and it's very important. Here's, for example, here's a wampum belt used by the Iroquois Confederacy, also known as the Haudenosaunee people of New York. And it's all purple and white wampum beads. So you may never look at a quahog shell the same way again from this point because the colors are just spectacularly beautiful. And you're lucky here in Harpswell, the reason that Quahog Farm was built there, it fronts upon this body of water on the far right in the middle of Sebascodegan or Great Island called Quahog Bay. See, the charts even tell you, Quahog Bay, right there, boom. Snow Island at the middle, a bunch of other coves off in directions. But you look at it, I thought for years, that's a very complicated shape, and I'll never find my way around that, and how in the world did they used to find their way around that? And it hit me when I was preparing this show that I think one answer might be, if you do a figure ground like this guy did with the ink blood, and you blow it up, do you see a face in there? I'm just telling you, that's Quahog Bay right there. And it sort of looks like a human face, just as this looks sort of like a human face. And it's an actually proved fact that human beings are always looking for faces in abstract patterns. So clouds, ink blot patterns, we're looking for faces. And this face is the face of Quahog Bay. And I would propose that if you were a Wabanaki Indian here 500 or 1,000 or 2,000 years ago, and you wanted to remember where all the coves were and the relationship thereof and where you met so-and-so, blah, 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 it's not like you're stupid and couldn't record something, but they didn't believe typically in the written word, but they did believe in art and in scratching and making gorgeous graphics out of birch bark. So you can scratch birch bark, a layer away in the birch bark, and you can get this two-tone figure grounds thing. You could very easily make your maps on birch bark and file the birch barks as maps and keep them, just as out west, a lot of the Plains Indians kept their maps and information on animal skins. So, oh yeah, but what's kind of interesting about the spirit of Quahog Bay, as it were, it's got a long, long, long nose sticking out there on the right. And I was just wanting to point out that, in our traditions, we've got some stories with figures with long, long noses too, Pinocchio. But anyway, when you start looking at figure grounds and how you're going to remember the shape of these lands and coves and how they all interrelate, let's look at Orr's Island for a second, right? That's also a very complicated shape. Now, there was a fellow who owned the store on Orr's, and as Josh Cleederman wore the shirt the other day to the beach, the store on Orr's used to sell this design as a t-shirt, proposing that Orr's Island's shape could be remembered as part of a lobster claw, which is a great graphic, I think. And so anyway, so that's what they did. It's not totally realistic when you get beyond the Cribstone Bridge. I don't think Bailey Island quite looks like that, but it's a nice start. I would like to propose that another way of looking at it would be, again, like a human figure. And if you put a little eye and a mouth there, you can sort of see it. It's a dancer either on a turtle or next to a turtle. There you go. So, I'm being a little free associating here, but I think it's allowed because in native times, and to this day in native cultures, the turtle is considered sacred. The turtle is a benevolent animal. The entire creation of this world began as a water body planet of which the turtle volunteered to allow humanity to settle on its back. And because that happened, to this day, natives refer to North America as Turtle Island. So it's a very sacred animal. It's a very sacred series of stories they have. And I wouldn't be surprised if maybe, some of the lands around Beals Cove were considered especially sacred because it was near the turtle's head part of the story. That's one possibility. But anyway, Auco-Cisco. So Auco-Cisco, this is kind of interesting, and I've got to apologize to some people. I had read somewhere that Auco-Cisco either meant like slimy, muddy islands, or it meant resting place of the heron. Now, given those two choices, most people would pick resting place of the heron as, a little more sanitized and beautiful. So I thought resting place of the heron had some substance to it. But in researching this talk, I found it's a more complicated story. And I think the story is, it evolves from the phrase from muddy island, or muddy islands plural. And let's go through that real quickly. You will have a little miniature Auco-Cisco museum here to tell you. The word first comes into the English printed repository of books in 1616 when this fellow, John Smith, who everyone else called him captain, but he preferred to be called Admiral of New England, of which he just coined the term New England. So there's a little self-confidence right there. That guy's pretty self-centered. Anyway, he produces this amazing map of New England, and in his book called Description of New England, which comes out in 1616, he talks about the spatial relationships and customs of these various countries, these native countries of Auco-Cisco, Agamenticus, Piscataqua, Agawam, and Namque. These are all major native tribes and leading right up to the Casco Bay area. The map that John Smith produced also showed that he wanted to call Casco Bay Harrington Bay, but apparently the king to whom he showed the map didn't like that, so it never did become Harrington Bay. But that's the map that John Smith came up with. And I kind of like it because we spent 30 years down in Salem, Mass., which is the center of the Naumkeag settlement, and it's nice to see somebody of John Smith's stature put them all together in the same sentence, which he did right here. He says the principal habitations were at blah, 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 Penobscot, the rivers were so-and-so, the Kennebec, Sagadahoc. So at that time, the Kennebec was most of the Kennebec River. Sagadahoc was the portion of the Kennebec River near the mouth of the river. and the Amalkagan would be the Amanaskagan, or which became the Androscoggin. And to those countries belong the people of, he's got all these different names and places, but he ends up, he says, to these are allied the countries of Alcosisco, Achaementicus, which is Agamenticus, Piscataquac, which would be Piscataqua, Gagawam, which would be Agawam, and Nomkeg, or Nomkek. So those are the major 5 he lists in the end there, which is really neat. He puts Alcosisco right in context with it. And in the 1920s, a woman in Portland, Maine, produced this map of Portland where she puts John Smith and his ship right there in Casco Bay and describes the region around it as the country of Alcosisco at the bottom of a large deep bay full of many great isles. That phrase was also uttered by John Smith. Now, so many great isles. If you go down to Narragansett Bay, you'll find that one of the big islands down there is called Aquidneck. And if you know your Algonquian languages, which are all related, Aquidneck is basically just the word that means at the island. It's the island. So you've got Aquidneck or Aquidnock. Aquidnock is Aquidneck, it's island. And usually when you want to make something plural, they put ASH on the end of it, an ash sound, like a Bashunash is many dugout canoes, Wetuash or many Wetus or houses. So I'm assuming, this is speculative here, don't hold me to it, but my theory is an Aquidnock is one island, Aquidnock Ash would be several islands. So now if you've got Aquidnock Ash is several islands, and you've got, we know for a fact from Reverend Silas Rand in the 1880s, produced a dictionary of the Mi'kmaq or Micmac language. He says that mud is Sesku, and Sesku has all these other related words relating to muddiness. And so if you put all that together, you get Aquidnock Ash, Sesku would be muddy islands. And now you go through time and people will try to shorten things. You just keep the last bunch of syllables. You got Okashsesko, Alcosisco. And I think that's the way it evolved. So it's really kind of interesting. It was a place name first, and it was a descriptive place name. That's what most native names are. They're describing physical characteristics of a place that are important for survival and that also allow you to recognize that you're there when you get there. So why would you care about muddy islands? So that seems kind of weird to us, right? We don't like mud. We clean it off as quickly as we get muddy, and we try to avoid mud whenever possible. But I think back in native cultures, you want the mud because these are islands that have clam flats, really important, and they have muddy bottoms to the coves and the bays where you can easily put in your sticks to make fish weirs so you can catch fish. So that's a survival thing, to know there's mud on the bottom of that land. So, and if you look locally, this is a picture of Beals Cove, looking from some of the Harpswell Heritage Land Trust property on the Houghton Graves property, looking north and over towards here. I'm sorry, over towards West Harpswell. You've got Rat Island in the middle of Beals Cove there. And so that just kind of gives you an orientation of islands and stuff. And if you're down there for any length of time, you'll notice there's seagulls coming along, and they pick up these quahog shells in their beaks, and they are routinely dropping them on the rocks right down here on the south end of that island. And so at low tide, you can see it's just peppered with quahog shells. And if anybody wants to make wampum jewelry, go there, you'll find all your stuff, you know. And but because nature and these seagulls are doing this themselves, it's hard to say when you see crushed shells around there to know whether it was seagull dropped or if it was human left behind. But so I think we need to call an archaeologist in at some point. It'll be fun because right near one of the shores on Beals Cove is this. It's a newly exposed site, and I think it could be a Native American shell midden. I'd be really curious about that. I'd like to get an expert opinion. And if you look sort of way back in the cove towards the west and towards the Pearl House, you've got this other section of the cove with a muddy bottom that has a little natural narrows there with rocks and stuff. And my guess is if you want to build a fish weir, that's your place to build a fish weir. Very little wall is required, and then you could catch your fish, and you've got a fish catching machine. So here's a map, and you can see sort of on the far left is the upper part of Beals Cove as a strategic area, but if you go just across Route 24 on Lowell's Cove, you've got these other coves coming in, and they too have beautiful muddy bottoms, and you can easily make fish weirs. So fishing becomes important on Orr's Island in ancient times. And everything that we think about, we know about Orr's Island fishermen and Harpswell fishermen, just logically grew out of that. It's just a natural extension of this ancient process in foodways. And now sometimes baskets were used, and Wabanaki baskets were used as part of a fish weir. They would build all your brush and sticks and stuff as a wall, and in the middle they would position baskets so the fish could come in and get caught in the basket. Then whoever's minding the fish weir just comes down and takes the basket away, and they've got their food for a year or whatever it is. So basket making is very important. We mentioned earlier too in the gift shops. This is Joseph Knockwood, who was a Mi'kmaq Indian who came to Orris Island for years and years. And Melinda gave me this picture. Maybe you know more about it. I don't know, Melinda. But he had a little basket crafting place, and he sold his goods right near where the Orris Island candy store is today. So I also, when I was researching my talk on Thomas Edison's daughter staying in the Houghton Graves, what became the Houghton Graves Park, my informant for that, Larry Paul, said he bought a birch bark canoe from Joe Knockwood. So, I mean, Joe was here weaving baskets, selling baskets, making birch bark canoes and things into the 40s, 1940s. So we're not talking ancient history here. But anyway, so all that I find interesting. But another thing happened to me a couple days, about a week ago. I went down to Garrison Cove near where Cook's Lobster House is, and I met a photographer down there named Jeff Troutman. He's from Ashland, Massachusetts. And so here's where I was. And he was trying to get a good picture of this scene. This was that day when all these clouds came rolling in, and you had this great contrast in the sky, and he wanted to get the contrast of these boats against that clouds, and he took a shot just very much like this. Anyway, we got to talking about photographic places you can go to get great pictures, and I told him about the Schiller Center in this talk, and I said the nature trails around here are amazing. You've got to check it out. You know, there's actually an osprey nest over here on the west near Wyers Island. And so, yeah, he went in, and in a matter of a couple of days, here he is on the far left with some of his sons from Ashland, Mass. And he went there. He got some moon pictures at night. Here's a full moon over Harpswell. Here's another one over Harpswell Waters, which is spectacular. And this is a picture he got of the osprey down in the cove, right down here near Wyers Island. And to me, this is the best picture of an osprey I've ever seen. I'm blown away by it. And anyway, I put those up there because what is that? That is being upfront and close with nature, raw nature, the power and the beauty of nature. And that's what Orris Island and Harpswell can still give to people. That's where it draws tourists now. That's where it drew tourists 100 years ago. And so that is an important resource. Now, when we get to look at things being distributed and cut apart, because Harpswell has so much water and so much separation all over the place, you'll find that it had, it's actually, I would think it is the steamboatingest town in the state, okay? I propose that modestly because I use the word town so we don't have to worry about Portland competing because that's a city. But if you look at just counting the number of steamboat docks that we had here, I was working with Jerry York on this and also from the great book on Casco Bay steamboats, and they list, I think, 8 steamboat docks and of these. So you got them at Gurnett, you got Orris Island, you got Bailey Island, you had South Harpswell. But if you get into it more and you read the fine print on these things, I think you're up to about 10 because Conde's Harbor also had steamboat docks over there, and also on the other side, the Lookout area was also so you had, I think, at least 10 steamboat docks back in the day. So that presented a whole new economy starting in the 1880s. And what you find is between the 1880s and 1950s, steamboats allowed for regular and frequent Harpswell contact with Portland. That's really important. Regular and easy contact between diverse parts of Harpswell. Conde's, Orris Island, Bailey Island, South Harpswell, all could communicate and bring things back and forth. The possibilities for Harpswellians to work on other islands, like Cliff Island, and the emergence of a multi-islandic or a pan-islandic culture, which is something we don't think about much anymore because we don't use the boats that aren't there anymore. But back in the day, that was such an important reality. A whole new newspaper came into being called the Casco Bay Breeze that was talking about the news on all these islands and on the steamboats because the steamboats ran regularly and they ran like clockwork and they ran like an extension of the railroad service. So pretty amazing. Now we know, from living here and hearing stories on the islands, we know they brought visitors, of course, they brought supplies, they brought the U.S. mail, they brought coal and firewood, they brought lumber, they brought freight. When I was talking to somebody on the other side over near the Graveyard Point there the other day, I met a guy who said, oh yeah, our house was brought over. He said it was brought over in pieces on the steamboat, and you can still see up in the attic where they numbered the pieces and all. But I mean, a lot of things were brought over that we don't think about anymore. It also, out of this, evolved tourism, the earliest tourism that Harpswell really had. And it brought efficiency of, goods and services. If you go down to Mackerel Cove on Bailey Island at low tide, you can actually find pieces of cut slab wood there in the mud that I suspect are left over from when David Percy's Senate was making wooden boats down there out of slab wood and cutting it all up. So you could bring all these products to the islands that you couldn't bring before, because you've got these big boats that can move anything. So it supported commerce, obviously, and a lot of hotels too. All your hotels all across Harpswell, there were dozens of them. So it was a two-way relationship. It brought lots of things to the islands, but it also brought lots of things to city people all over the country. And so because of that connection with the larger city folk, what grows out of this is new marketing opportunities. So if you want to talk about marketing Harpswell and the islands, this is where it gets really interesting. I would say there was sort of a fairy tale approach taken to the historical facts. A little looseness, shall we say, was taken with facts if it could be used to promote the islands and bring in more people. And I would like to present three sort of historical lies or mushy areas that support this idea. One is this whole notion of there being calendar islands. That's a beautifully romantic phrase, and it would make you think there's exactly 365 islands out there at all times, and there's no tides that change what's an island or what isn't an island, which of course we know isn't true. There's actually, I'm told, there's over 400 real islands, and maybe up to 1,000 islands depending on what you count as an island at what time. So that number 365 was totally fabricated, and was only a marketing ploy. And yet they did great things with it. Look at this brochure from 1904. You've got the Harpswell Steamboat Company advertising 365 island route in Casco Bay, the favorite excursion out of Portland. And so it was a big deal. It was a very big deal. You could say it's false history or fake history or bogus history or something if you want to get technical about it, but it was a great story, wasn't it? Now, the second area where I see the same kind of fuzziness happening is relating to the Harriet Beecher Stowe legacy. And you can find 80% of your old postcards and stuff are promoting specific sites as being where this or that fictional character lived. Well, so how can you actually have a historic site for a fictional character? I find that very interesting. But that's what they told people. So like just at the end, I guess, of Bayview Road here, you had the home of Aunt Roxy and Rui, characters in the Pearl of Oars Island story. But hey, they lived there. That was their home, I mean, so there's a little bit of false advertising here and wishful thinking going on in all of the Pearl of Oars Island postcards that were produced. This is a neat one I just found today. I think the original's in Brunswick, I believe. And look what it said on the top. I made all these photos, and there are now 18 new ones of oars. So it's like, okay, somebody is really having a great time making up postcards to sell. But yeah, the Kittredge House, this, as we may know, is the gambrel-roofed Joseph Orr House on what became the Bond property and the Oars Island Campground property. And that's the real mid-18th century landmark on the island. But it gets promoted as this Kittredge House because of its supposed relations with Captain Kittredge from the story. So there's the second major category of fiction relates to the Harriet Beecher Stowe promotion. The third area, I have to confess, I believe now, is this whole notion of Casco and Alco Cisco, meaning resting place of the great blue heron, I think is one more of these things. And there's a huge story behind it, and we ought to write a book about it, actually. It's quite complicated. So I'm just going to call it for now some Casco confusions, to be polite. And I think that what happened was the year 1916, a book was published called Casco Bay Yarns, and that book puts it in print that, yes, it means resting place of the herons. And it gets very poetic. But the title of the book includes the word yarns, so you can't sue them for fraud or anything because it's just basically a yarn, So anyway, but we do hear that Casco meant heron. We don't ever hear really that it means resting place of the herons, whatever. So there's a bit of a fictional or fantasy element to this. Now, when you look at the steamboat side of things, we can also talk about context. And what's interesting is you take boats like this, the Shenandoah out of Vineyard Haven on Martha's Vineyard, topsail schooner. The great age of sail persisted for centuries and centuries, and obviously it's have beautiful sailboats, but they all relied on the wind. And the wind, as we all know, is not a steady force or reliable source, and it doesn't blow all the time. Now, at some point, they actually did experiment. This is a cross-section through a horse-powered ferry. For a while, they were looking at animal power as a motive force, and they had a treadmill on these vessels, so the horses would go around, and as the treadmill rotated, it was geared to turn paddle wheels and push the boat across. So they did have animal-powered boats for a while, but what really happens is when the railroad comes in, and people see that as quick and speedy, and it's timely, it's very efficient, they want that same power on a boat. And that's what the steamboat is. It's putting the power of a railroad on a boat. And this is one of the tall engines that was used, like the one that's used in most of the steamboats that we've talked about today for Casco Bay. And if you go to the main Maritime Museum in Bath, and in the front of that, you'll see in their lobby, they've got one of these full-scale, big thing. It's like they are impressive to look at. And what happens is steam is brought into a cylinder and into which there's a piston, and as the steam expands, the piston moves, and it's geared to a crankshaft, and it moves the shaft very much like an automobile, but instead of gas exploding, it's steam expanding, and that's what's pushing things along. And now these are some other pictures of, again, a cylinder boat on a steamship. Here's a crew aboard the Alco Cisco, a crew shot, showing the various mate James Foy and different Captain James Long. But this, you're getting inside the Alco Cisco now, which is kind of cool. These were the first motorboats, though. That's my point. They're the first motorboats. Right nowadays, we take motorboats for granted, and there's, there are diesel ones, there's gasoline ones, whatever. You don't see the steam ones very often anymore, but they do still exist, and people who do own these things will have reunions and still use them. If you want a lot of fun, do a YouTube video search for steamboat working or steamboat meeting, and you'll get pictures of these people bringing their little boats in, and you see all the parts moving. It's great fun. Now, there is a John Fitch that lives here in Harpswell on the other side, and he emailed me when I was getting this show together, and he said, "Don't forget to talk about the other John Fitch." And he said, so I said, "Thank you." So yes, even though you may have heard of somebody else as being the inventor of the steamboat, this guy from Pennsylvania named John Fitch is the first developer of the steamboat, which was a uniquely American invention. He lived in Pennsylvania. He died in 1798. So that means in the 18th century, he was developing working steamboats. Now, here he is. Here's John Fitch. There's actually a small museum in Pennsylvania telling his story. And his first idea, he didn't quite know how to make the thing go along in the water. So he knew about how Indians and people paddle canoes. And he decided he was going to replicate the paddling motion of a canoe, and he did that. And through a lot of mechanical ingenuity, and people have made a working model of this thing. And again, you can YouTube video this thing and look it up. It's crazy. It's these paddles that are just doing this thing through the water in an organized fashion, and it does move the boat. Okay. He then thought, well, maybe it'd be more efficient if we do what ducks do. And instead of just being on canoe paddles, we actually, we wag our little duck feet. And so he actually created another steamboat that gets along by paddling like duck feet, which is kind of cool. So anyway, John Fitch was a kind of crazy character, and unfortunately he died before he could really push his ideas to market, and these were all happening right around the time of the Revolutionary War, so it was a very early period for the country. It's not till 1807 that you get this second fellow, Robert Fulton, in New York. And Fulton ends up becoming remembered as the developer of the steamboat, mostly because he got it to be commercially successful on the Hudson River. And he got this fast packet service going up and down the river using paddle wheels on the sides of the boats. And the paddle wheel, here's Fulton's paddle wheels. I think they may have been inspired by an undershot water wheel on a gristmill, because they look very similar. In one of them, though, you're actually taking the water power and turning it into rotary motion. In this one, you're taking the rotary motion and turning it into, moving water. So it's the same invention, just used differently. And but we find that the side-wheel, paddle-wheeled steamboats were the sort of earliest, really successful kinds. And they went up and down the Hudson and all up and down the coast. The Maine Maritime Museum has a picture of this one. They're selling it as a postcard. This was the TF Secor, S-E-C-O-R. And she apparently went up the Kennebec River in the 1850s. So there you go. There's a side-wheel paddle boat in Maine. And, oh yeah, that's the blurb on that. And it was built in New York. And here's the marine engineer who did it, Mr. Secor himself. He had his own ironworks right in New York. And boats that were similar, you know, but bigger size now, were also used for excursion boats and also bringing tourists up to mid-coast Maine. Here's the Sagadahoc steamer, a large side paddle wheeled steamer. State of Maine, again, similar with 2 stacks. Now, on some of these, you'll see they have masts, and there's usually 2 reasons for that. Some of the steamboats had masts because they could also, one, they have sails to be able to push you along in case the steam wasn't working. But of equal, if not more importance, is some of these masts were built so they could stretch tension cables, and out of the masts and the cables, they could stiffen the whole boat. Because these boats are being built very lightly for speed, and yet they're being built very big to accommodate as many people as possible. And the problem with a really long boat like that, you know, especially when, no matter what it's made of, it has a danger to break in half. And so when they put these things on the top of it like that, it helps stiffen the whole thing and make it less liable to crack in 2. Here's the Kennebec coming up, you know, the river in Maine, and we've got a rusticator's view because you're looking through pine cones. So that was a, you know, pretty nice picture. And the Portland, of course, is very famous for the, you know, the gale that in the 1890s that sunk this beautiful steamboat. They finally found this boat on the bottom of Stellwagen Banks off of Massachusetts, and she's there. But that was a big steamboat. This one, the Drew, I'm not sure where she moved, but the neat thing about this one is look at all those masts. So those are, again, all those masts and cables, they put up to prevent what they called hogging, which meant sagging. So those are all hog masts with hog cables on them. And then to further stiffen it, they put a huge metal truss. You see it right behind the big water wheel? So these big metal trusses, it'd be kind of like if you just, you know, the DOT is going to take down the Frank J. Wood Bridge, right? We need to propose that we recycle the Frank J. Wood Bridge as a stiffener of a steamboat. And that's kind of what they're doing. They're building a truss bridge on a boat. And they did that to make the whole thing stiff and sturdy. But you got these things also going out west. The Mississippi River steamboats were famous for having races and occasionally exploding. You also got stern-wheeled steamboats, especially on the Mississippi. So there's less liable of the side wheels being hit by you know, moving tree trunks and things. And again, look at all the masts and the hogging cables on that one. Beautiful picture of a stern-wheeled steamboat. But, you know, by the late 19th century, you got the propeller being recognized as the easiest way to move one of these things along. And so most of the steamboats that people remember going in Casco Bay were these propeller-driven ones. Now, the Maine Central Railroad also worked in cahoots with the steamboat companies to produce and distribute some of these maps. So this map from about 1900, bird's eye view of Casco Bay, showing the steamboat routes, was distributed by the railroad. And if we get to the right side of that map, you can see we're now in Harpswell waters, and you can see where the steamboats were coming in on South Harpswell by the American House, and they were coming into Mackerel Cove on Bailey Island, and they were coming in the Orr's Island landing downhill from the Merritt House. So those are the 3 major stopping points. And if you kind of blow it up and look closer, I did this one because I was trying to see exactly where the American House was in relation to the landing over there. And it's actually quite a distance, I think, or it wasn't exactly right in front of where the steamboats came in. But if you also look at the history of Casco Bay steamboats, you'll come across this article that was written by a Captain Larry Legere, who worked with the Casco Bay lines. And he basically says that scheduled ferry service to all the Casco Bay islands started about 1870, but in 1878 was begun a year-round company to do the service, and that was the Casco Bay Steamboat Company, 1878. And then within a few years, to compete with it, the Harpswell Line, or the Harpswell Steamboat Company, comes into creation in 1881, and it offered these outer islands as far as Bailey and Orr's Islands. And then after a recession in the 1890s, they merged the 2 lines as the Casco Bay and Harpswell Steamboat Company in 1907, and that, you know, it went on from there. So some of your letterheads have Casco Bay Steamboat Company, you know, sponsorship. There's also an HSC for Harpswell Steamboat Company. Henry Porter Dewey was the major, shaker and mover of the Harpswell Steamboat Company. And I believe his middle name, Porter, tells you he's related to the Porters of Freeport and Porter's Landing, where there was also more steamboat activity. But in addition to the Casco Bay and Harpswell being the 2 major and best remembered steamboat companies, there was also a McDonald Steamboat Company that ran this boat called the Pejepscot. And the Pejepscot, the McDonald Steamboat Company, ran it out of Portland. John H. McDonald was the manager. They had two steamers, the Pejepscot and the Percy 5, or Percy V, I don't know how you read that. And as far as the Pejepscot goes, here's a nice picture of her right at Gurnett. We're looking north here, near the Gurnett Bridge, and that's the Pejepscot steamboat right there. Big boat, in the same position just about. We're now looking at another steamer, the American at the Gurnett Bridge. And I remember this bridge was replaced and modernized, I guess, back in the 80s, and that little building went away at that time. But here, on the other side of things, the McDonald's company was putting everybody on the boats in Portland. Here's a picture of the public landing in Portland and the McDonald's Steamer Company building with steamers for Orr's Island right there. So you see what I mean? Orr's Island was a metropolitan landmark. You didn't know that, but we were, you know. And there's a blow-up of what's going on there. And another company, a fourth one, besides Casco Bay, Harpswell, and the McDonald Company, was this Falmouth Foreside Steamboat Company, which also ran the Madeline and the Phantom. And their ads talk about they're coming up along the coast through Freeport and the Great Chesapeake, et cetera, finally to Harpswell Lookout. And I think by that they mean actually the Lookout Point over there on that side. So here's their Madeline, and that would have gone to, there's Lookout Point. And there's the Lookout Point House. That was the major hotel near that landing. There was also the Ocean View House on the other side, kind of directly across from the road down to Cook's and that part of West Harpswell. Ocean. And there were other hotels on Bailey's and Orr's as well. Oh yeah, so if you look at where the Ocean View was supposed to have stood at the bottom of American Eagle Lane, and if you extend American Eagle Lane, you come down to just about where West Shore Drive meets the Garrison Cove Road there. But anyway, so I'd like to see us do something more with all of this. I'd like to see maybe a Steamboat Interpretive Center of Maine come into being, or Maine Steamboat Study Center, Inc., or STEAM, Steam Transportation Explorations in America and in Maine. I like acronyms. And there's this already, the dominant nonprofit behind steamboat history is this group, the SSHSA, or Steamship Historical Society of America. And I was looking at their papers and everything, and it turns out they're in Rhode Island, and they don't have anything for this northern part of New England at all. And so I said, you know, if we do something with steamboats up here in Casco Bay, you know, could we maybe become a chapter of you and, you know, be northern New England? He said, oh, absolutely. He said, well, more than that, we'll help you write an article. We'll publish an article in our magazine if you want to get that going. So that's pretty neat. We have a major horse here that could pull a cart. And then I have this picture in a book that my wife gave me recently of steamboats up on the Penobscot River. This shows the last moments of a steamboat that sunk there on the shore with a guy looking really sad on shore. And to me, this sort of summarizes our situation today, right? We love these things, they're beautiful, but there's nothing left to see in person because they've all been either sunk or burned or taken away. I know now that there was at least 13 of these vessels, beautiful steamboats, here they are by name, a baker's dozen that came to Harpswell back in the day. We've mentioned just a few of them up until this point, but here's all 13 that I've found, the big ones. And I recently found at the Orr's Island Schoolhouse, where the Sebastian artist was just having an art show that's still going on right now, by the way, this wonderful glass negative pops up that shows the pilot house of the Sebastian steamboat, and you can see now in this picture exactly how that signage was designed. So if you wanted to exhibit on the Sebastian steamboat, it's halfway made for you right there. Here's an ad for Harpswell Steamboat talking about how in 1899 the steamer Al Cisco will leave Portland Pier daily, etc., for all these islands, include Bailey and Orr's Island, and return at so-and-so, running Sundays, and Isaiah Daniels is general manager. Well, the Daniels apparently had a house, one of the Daniels right next to the Orr's Bailey Yacht Club, so that's kind of cool. This other article from the Casco Bay Breeze talks about how the Sebastian steamboat and the Al Cisco used to do frequent races. And the boat that had the most steam pressure at the time of meeting and efforts to raise the pressure by forced draft were always exciting to the passengers. Yes, I would think they would be exciting because you don't want to cross that little threshold when the whole thing blows up, do you? But you could do what you can to make the boat move faster. Now, I'm a retired architect, and I used to use these triangles all the time, and one of them is a 30, 60, 90 triangle. And I just noticed the other day that, that's the angle, the 60-degree angle, that you really can look at. If you want to describe the main approach between East and West Harpswell, that's a 60-degree angle off the true horizontal, and it just goes right on up. And in the 60 degree, you can also take, if you want to draw Sebascodegan properly, that's the angle for the top of the 1. You can think of Sebascodegan's shape as being the number 10, with the 1 and the 0, and the O is broken apart a little bit, and they touch and they don't quite separate. And that not quite touching, and that not quite separating, is what we think the name actually means. So what's interesting is this woman, Fanny Hardy Ekstrom, who is an expert in Penobscot culture and Penobscot language, wrote books on the Indian place names of New England and all. She found that this, in the name Sebascodegan, the Sebas part, the Sebas part, the first 2 syllables, means almost through. It's like something is almost it's almost a water passage, but not quite, because it's connected by land. And so the Sebastoguk River, she says, comes from that. Well, the Sebastoguk River apparently evolved in the Sebastokuk, and the Seb or Sebas prefix also is the origin to Sebasco as a place name, as Sebascodegan Island, of course, the Sebastokuk. All these are related native places, which is kind of interesting. And it's reflected in the geography, the almost broken apartness of that little bit of land right in front of the Nazarene church. That's what's holding the island together, and that's what gives this island its name. On the Sebastokuk River, which is accessible from the Kennebec, people found recently a piece of red jasper flint that was being worked into an arrowhead years ago. And that, I think, is kind of neat, because red jasper is not found in Maine really at all. And they're saying this proves that the natives really valued that color, really valued that material, and they were trading great distances to bring in these stones. So keep your eyes open. You might find some of these beautiful red jasper pieces around these waters, these shores. You just don't know. But I'm digressing a little bit. But if we now go back to the Maine Maritime Museum and look at their photographs of the Alco-Cisco steamboat, they have this one from about 1900. This is kind of nice. This is the Alco-Cisco tied up at what was called York's Landing. York's Landing was Bailey Island's first steamboat landing, and it was on Lowell's Cove on Bailey Island, on the site that became Skilling's Boatyard after 1948. So this is the Alco-Cisco coming in, and she's got on her bow, a flagstaff, and on the top she's got a humongous banner that I think says Alco-Cisco on it. Then she's got other flags of colossal size. And Mr. York down there, Lendell York, used that and opened that as a steamboat landing, because he wanted to be able to bring in great quantities of firewood and coal to sell at his store. And so here you see firewood piled up on part of the wharf, and you've got this upper walkway that went to a big coal storage building. So wood and coal were what he was most interested in. I think we could do an album on just the Alco-Cisco name and place and steamboat. We could have fun. Before Frappier wrote his beautiful book, back in 1969, a guy named Bill Dunn, D-U-N-N, produced this book, which is much harder to find, called Casco Bay Steamboat Album. You can get this on Amazon.com, though. This is a picture, actually, of the Alco-Cisco, the same vessel tied up at the Great Landing on Chebeague. So this kind of scene would have been seen through all of the central landing on Chebeague. And there's Mr. Dunn. Mr. Dunn himself had been headmaster of the Kents Hill Academy between 1942 and 1965. He retired in 65. Unfortunately, he was collecting steamboat stuff for years. He loved it, and he was going to produce a book on it, but he passed away. And then I guess his family pulled together his materials and published the album right after he died. But here's his title page. He's got a picture of a steamboat and a steam whistle. And he's got this flag on the front that says USM would be for U.S. mails. So I guess that was required to be flown whenever a Casco Bay steamboat was carrying the U.S. mails. Here's Henry Porter Dewey, who started the Harpswell Steamboat Company. These are his dates and where he was born. We don't know that much about him yet. There's a lot to learn. He apparently worked with this fellow Jacob S. Winslow in Portland. And Jacob Winslow is a picture of him. There's a colossal granite monument and sculpture of him in, I think, Evergreen Cemetery in Portland. But here he is, Jacob Snow Winslow. And it's remembered that he was a businessman who founded the Winslow Company, a firm that came to own the largest fleet of sailing vessels ever to operate in the Atlantic Ocean. So that's rather large scale. This fellow had lots of ships, apparently. And because Dewey, worked with Winslow, he achieves a status that he could now become president of his own steamboat company. So here's an ad that was printed about 1890 for the Harpswell Steamboat Company, and they're offering 40-mile sail among the islands of Casco Bay. They're advertising about 1890 three vessels, the American Gordon and the Alice, and Isaiah Daniels is general manager of the line. When we get to, oh yeah, the story really does begin again at Lowell's Cove on Bailey Island, where one of your local historians is Nancy Orr Johnson Jensen, and she produced this fantastic book called Bailey Island Memories, Pictures, and Lore. I recommend getting that. That's also sold down at Land's End if you'd like a copy. Here's a picture of her as a young girl that was printed in the book, which is kind of fun. But the book is really valued because she reprinted a lot of photographs that her father, Linwood had collected. So, Linwood Johnson. And this is an early picture. It says, at left the steamer Gordon, the first steamboat at York's Landing. Well, that's interesting, and that makes sense. So that would have been like an 1881 scene would have involved this vessel at that landing for Bailey Island. Very simple boat, you know, a very rudimentary wharf. And this, Jim Skillings gave me this picture. This is an astounding picture that shows the same York's Landing from the boat's point of view. And you've got, this is a later picture, I'm guessing about 1900, but you've got men with dollies and, you know, trying to lug these heavy steamer trunks to get onto the boat. And then you've got a couple of kids there below this bell, you know, just having a fun time waiting and watching all the commotion. And then you've got this elevated walkway that goes to the big building at the left, which would have been the coal storage building is the theory. And it's just a great scene. And up there, the building directly above the coal structure, that's the house which Lendell B. York lived in. And that survived until March 23rd, 1955, when I was -2 years old. So that was my mother-in-law's house in its later years. That was the Skillings house, Betty Skillings. And that burned in 55, and it got replaced by the ranch house that is there now at the corner of Steamboat Road and Route 24. You got Aunt Jenny's house there. You got the schoolhouse here. You got a little part of the church. It's just a wonderful picture. You can see very few trees, and so you can see all across the island. Here's another picture of the Gordon taken at a different landing. This one's on Orr's Island. And she's, again, just very simple vessel. You've got a horse and wagon. It looks like a horse and buggy right there on the wharf, and a fellow with looks like a hat and vest holding the carriage. Here's a blow-up of that, and you see a couple of guys standing up near on the very top of the roof. It looks like almost a Wild West scene. It's so primitive and simple. But that was Harpswell, Maine in the 1880s. And we're told that the Gordon itself could carry 250 passengers, and she had a length of 90 feet. She was about the same size as the steamer McCoy is after 1905. Anyway, so the steamer Gordon, 250 passengers, huh? Let's go back to that picture. Let's see, we got about 40 people here. We want 250 people here. We need 6 roomfuls of this size on that vessel. Oh, I'm sorry. If we happen to hit a ledge or something, you know, we're not paying attention, we got one lifeboat right there. And it's probably a second lifeboat on the other side. So the whole lifeboat idea didn't really click as something you need until the Titanic. And the Titanic was in 1912. So all your pictures before 1912, there's just a dearth of lifeboats. It's kind of amazing. Here's an aerial view of Lowell's Cove, Bailey Island, where a lot of the action was happening. Linwood Lane leads down to where the Johnson house is, where Nancy Orr Johnson grew up. Looking directly across Lowell's Cove, there's a stone wharf there on a point of land. And way over here on the top side, the north side, is the point where the York's Landing was that brought the people and everything up to Steamboat Road, and that's where the York house was. I point some of these things out because what's kind of neat is if you go out to that stone wharf, which is still owned by the Skillings family, by the way out there, if you go out there and you stand on it and you look due east, here's what you see. You see the Linwood Johnson house right there. So that's where Nancy grew up. And then if you kind of pan over, and here you can, I'm sorry, I changed the zoom lens to a wide angle. Here you got the stone wharf right there. You got the Johnson house. You've got what was the marina, and a lot of you guys know this area a lot better than I do. This is a rebuilt building, which is where the small Quonset hut was built by Bill Skillings and Carl Skillings. They used that as one of their boat building facilities, woodworking shop. And a marine railway was right nearby. There's Bill, my father-in-law. And here's an aerial view that Jim found, another great one, taken about 1960, showing the way Skilling's Boatyard redeveloped that old property. You can see they had a marine railway in the middle. They had a woodworking shop on the right in that Quonset. They had a big Quonset for storage of boats. They had a machine shop right there, that little building on the left of the marine railway. And I point all this out because, oh, here's also a Disney artist-produced sketch of Skilling's Boatyard as it was, I think, in the 1960s, looking back towards the cove. But if you kind of pan around, you can see there's now a public right-of-way that goes down to the water, really right near between what was the machine shop and the property line to the Parsiacs. And anybody can go to the water using that as an access now. And that was pretty close to the access that brought you to the wharf in the old days. So this would be a nice place to think about bringing in some signage or something to interpret the steamboat story too. I say that because I think it's a really rich history, but there's not much to look at when you're there now. It's just that, you know. And there's this. This is the point of land with the little point of rocks on the end, and you got cormorants standing on it. Now, if we go back to, oh yeah, so this is the Alice. It was another one of those early boats that they used to tie up here. There's the Alice. She was built by a fellow named Samuel H. Barber out of Brewer, which is up near Bangor. And he built over 20 steamboats. And this was a really beautiful little boat with all these arcaded windows and stuff. She was a gorgeous, gorgeous vessel. But Beth Hill produced a history of Bailey Island as well. And in Beth Hill's book, she printed this picture called Steamboat at York's Landing, 1888. Well, what's interesting to me, and I think to Jim also, is that you look at this picture critically, the rocks in the foreground there are the same rocks that those cormorants were standing on before, which tells you the photographer was on that same stone wharf that we were just on taking our pictures. So everything else pretty much has changed, but the slope of the land behind the built structures in the boat and the rock in the foreground tell you that's where that was taken. Now we know also that the date is a little wrong in this one, because this, if you look at the steamboat closely, she's got 6 major windows in the middle section, and here's a blow-up of that one. And 6 is the magic number here, so 6 windows. And yet, in 1906, the Detroit Publishing Company produced this postcard of the steamer Sebastian of the Orr's Island Line, and I would propose this is the exact same boat. And we know that with its 6 windows, the steamer Sebastian was actually built in the mid-1890s, so it was probably an 1896, not 1886 picture, but whatever. So that's a little, there were 2 waves of steamboat building, it seems. In the 1880s, they built to get the whole Hartsville steamboat line going, and by the mid-90s, they built a bunch of several other boats to improve things. I think because the Chicago World's Fair of 1893 got everyone excited about making mass improvements, and in the 1890s, people were recharged to make bigger and faster steamboats, and the Sebastian was sort of that second group. So that was a 1906 picture. Here's an 1888 steamboat. That was taken. This is a steamboat that was built in the year that Beth Hill thought their last picture was taken. This is the Merricaneag, and she's tied up at York's Landing again. And close up of that, you can see the little marker out there beyond the people. But when the Merricaneag turns around, you can see that she doesn't have 6 windows on the other side, on any side. She's got 9. So she is a very different vessel than the one that we saw. So there's a little typo in that. But we're running out of time, so let me just run through quickly. I want to show you some steamboats, mostly the Alco Cisco, in different scenes. And this is kind of, you know, I'd love to see something where you actually get almost a movie made, where you can watch the vessel go and almost hear in your mind, you know, the whistles blowing and the people having fun. And this is the steamboat wharf. This is a picture that Nancy or Johnson Jensen published recently in the Anchor. And here's a picture again from the boat looking shoreside with the way things look there with crowds and everything. Pretty amazing. Some of the buildings nearby are still there, so that mansard roofed house above it on the road is still there. But the whole wharf is gone, and the walkway to the wharfs are gone, and most other things. There's just this concrete with big holes in it where these timbers used to connect to other structure. So it's kind of sad. But that's the Steamboat Wharf Road that led to the Mackerel Cove Steamboat Wharf back in the day. Here's again your mansard roof building is right behind on the left there. This is Mackerel Cove today, standing on the wharf site, near the wharf site, looking across the west to Abner Point, and what you see over there is an overgrown view of the Smith house. Now, the Smiths, I believe, if this is where Pete Smith lived? Yeah, okay. So Pete Smith, I believe, was the grandson of this fellow, Xanthus Russell Smith. Xanthus Russell Smith was a Pennsylvania artist who produced some of the best paintings of steamboats that were ever painted in this country, including this one that shows the Alabama sinking, which was a Confederate warship on the left being attacked by the Kearsarge. So anyway, Xanthus Russell Smith was a big important figure. Phil Cottle's boat was the Zaris, XRS, again the same, it was Pete Smith's boat, was named for his grandfather. So the Smith family was nationally important for steamboat paintings as well, and they had a house right there on Abner Point Road. Here's a 1940s picture of the Alco Cisco coming into that steamboat wharf. This was a Larry Paul produced photograph from the 40s, another one. And he just, this is a great 1940s picture. And he wrote me back in December that the boat arrival was a big event, you know, and he goes on to great detail about they were visiting and they were coming up, they were taking the boat over. And he also talks about how he took some 8mm color movies from, and one of them shows the steamers racing each other and everything. So, you know, if we get a steamboat group going, we got to track this down and show this footage and preserve the footage. These are some other pictures taken at the same time of, look at all the boats in 1947 in Mackerel Cove. I would propose there's not a single fiberglass boat there. These are all wooden hulls, and they're beautiful. You know? And here's, on the far left, that's Larry Paul, who's now much older, but here he is as a young man in a wooden skiff in Beals Cove on Orr's Island. And the skiff that his parents had built was called Mr. Punch, because the family was into puppet making and theater, and that's what they did. This is another, here's a Jenny Prince produced or published postcard down at the landing at Orr's Island near the Merritt House before it got bigger. And you can see again, the crowds are very excited. The boats just come in and people are walking up and away from the steamboat landing. Here's another one of, here you've got the Alco Cisco tied up to Orr's Island major landing at a time when there were several buildings on the wharf. Great picture. This one I've also found is another similar shot of the Alco Cisco. And you've got some guys in a dory in the foreground. Whoops, a little blurry on that one. Sorry about that. Oh yeah, here's a better view of that one. This came from a book on, you know, scenic photos in Maine. And this is called Famous Scenes at Orr's Island, reached by the Harpswell steamers. And you got the boat, you got the people, you got the wharf, you got the so-called Captain Kittredge cottage. Actually a Georgian mansion, I'm sorry to say. You know, and so you got these great pictures, and that was part of the whole tourism scene. You got pictures of the Merritt House, which is offering shore dinners. So the whole economy was boosted by the steamboats and the steamboat-related hotels and stores and structures. And it was an amazing era. I never saw any of this in person because I didn't come to these islands until the 70s and 80s, by which time they were gone. But these are great pictures, and we need a Harpswell Steamboat Heritage Association, I've decided. Or we need a Harpswell Steamboats Miniatures Museum. I'd love to see a room full of models of these things. I think that'd be great. If you work with school kids, you could, you know, have a whole class make 30 models of whatever ship, and then have the class vote on which model is the most accurate. We could do steam transport, et cetera, around Maine, steam, and do something. So anyway, there's a lot of possibilities. It would be fun to get a building like this, for example, which is down near a Graveyard Point on the other side, you know, and just have it as a headquarters for one of these groups, and then have a bunch of models to show. I think it would be a fantastic, fun thing. Nowadays, if you go to New York City, you can find the last surviving Casco Bay steamboat of any significant size that's still afloat. This is called the Yankee Ferry, and yet in our days when she was steaming to Harpswell, she was known as the Machagone, or Machagone, and so she's still floating, and she's now a home for an artist couple. And it was praised, I think, at about $1 million a few years ago. Now, on a much smaller scale, if you go to Mystic Seaport, you can still see the Sabino, which also came to Orr's Island. Here, this is the proof of her coming to Orr's Island in the 50s. And so that little boat is still working, and that is the last apparently working steam-powered steamboat still in U.S. waters, is the Sabino, which is kind of cool. Now the Amida, I guess, I don't know how you pronounce that, Amida or Amida, this woman's name, this was another notable steamboat that came in, and here she is tied up at Orr's Island Landing, I believe in the 1940s. And again, all wooden hulled boats, and that's the big steamer. Here's the same vessel pulling away from the Mackerel Cove, Bailey Island steamboat landing at a time when Abner Point didn't have as many buildings on it as it has now. And then Don Westfall gave this to me. He found this, took this over at Hartsville Historical Society. This is a bell that was saved from the steamboat landing over there at Hartsville Center, which is pretty sweet. And that's on exhibit over there at the Historical Society. Here's a picture taken in the 40s showing the Alco Cisco when she was sailing under the name Green Island. And she was renamed the Green Island because she was bringing sailors from Portland out to Jewel Island, where there's a big military facility then. And I think they were afraid that the sailors couldn't spell Alco Cisco if they had a few two drinks or remember the name right. So they just took Green Island. There are some Green Islands just south and west of Jewel Island. Here's a picture of the Alco Cisco. The picture comes to us from the Museum of the Great Lakes, apparently. And there's this great picture of the stern of her, too. So that's the end of the show, almost, because I just wanted to bring you up to speed. A couple days ago, I was at the show at the Sebascodegan Artists show in the old schoolhouse. Now, the group started off in this little church near the Nazarene Church on Sebascodegan, and they had this as their graphic originally. Well, now they're also showing other places. And on August 4th, I went to the old schoolhouse on Oars, and they had a show in there. I saw some carved wooden figures made by my biology teacher from Bath, Wayne Robbins, and that was nice to see. But I met Elaine Haranich. Elaine, is that how you pronounce it? Thank you. I'm not good at these H&R names. But, and Elaine directed me, here's some of her work. Here's one of her paintings of the two Carlton Bridges in Bath, one of them under construction and the old one. Here's a photograph of the same scene. Elaine can take a scene that most people would ignore or try not to see, and she can make it into just an exciting composition. I'm impressed by her talent. Bath is the city of ships, so it's appropriate that she from Bath also introduced me to the artwork of a fellow named Rick Carney from Brunswick, Maine. And Rick's good at incorporating stained glass and architectural items or artifactual items. And he had this glass plate negative of the Sebascodegan steamboat in the centerpiece. And Sebascodegan Artists has kept that artwork now. They use it as their like little iconic piece that wherever they show now, they put that in the window. Now, if you look at that glass plate negative, it's incredible. The resolution is really superb. And you can really see the guys and the sign, like I said before. You can also see the ship's wheel there, and there's a bunch of flowers that have been put, kind of on the dashboard. And then above the awning, the Victorian awning, and up on the roof, you could see the gold-leaf eagle right there. This picture is just really, and the original is amazing. The detail is right there. You got the eyes, the beak, all the feathers. You got the claws. It's like if we took this picture to Wayne Robbins, we gave him a couple days, he could probably produce us an exact replica of that flying eagle. That'd be pretty amazing. And his uncle was Leon Robbins. I used to know Leon in Bath quite well. He was an antique dealer in Bath, and Leon was learning the art of gold leaf. He had these ancient sheets of gold foil, really like as thick as a butterfly wing, and that's what they would use to apply to the wood to make the gold leaf. So anyway, that's the show. Thank you very, very much. If I am interested in old steamboats and early Hartsville history, here's my email address, so please write me if you want to keep the conversation going. And that's all, folks. We got to thank some people here. Phil, Bill, Don, Julia, Steve, Jerry, Christine, Melinda, Larry, Jay, Barbara McGowan, the Skillings family, the family of the Frappiers, Josh Kleederman, John Henning, Eric Jones, Lee Taberge, Donna Fasoli of Hartsville Community TV, Holly, Joe's assistant Nikki, Jarrett, also Jonathan have helped here, also John Fitch, Al Strout, Jeff Troutman, Susan Beagle, Earl Shuttleworth, and Betty Copeland I hold as sort of mentors. They helped us with the survey back in the 80s and 90s. Oh yeah, and then all these 4 artists from Sebascodegan Artists. So it's been a group effort, it's been a community effort. We all thank you. Yeah.
Steamboat, where have you gone? Where is your lonesome song? Like a mighty organ plays an old refrain, your whistle blew away my cares and lonely pain. Steamboat, blow your whistle again. Thank you.